Platform 2. Thank you.
Ayan. Kasi ang sila tayo. Maandar yan.
Kailangan may
Anong kailangan? This is our first day. We're just meeting up in the airport. So,
שימו לב, כאן גלעד הדין. אסור לשאת נשק בכל האולמות של נמל התעופה. תודה רבה. Your attention please. Carrying weapons is prohibited in all terminal halls. Thank you.
the younger one. Ikot ka para din.
What energy she has!
You've got a lot of energy.
Wow! Cannot read you tomorrow because now you will, if you are so tired and so full of so the two are yours. Where are you from? I start with the cross instead of starting by Galilee, Nazareth.
Welcome everybody. We got everybody. This is always the little bit of tough getting everybody out and found everybody, and a couple lost luggages and everything, but we're everybody here. We have 9 waiting for us up at the hotel who came in a day early. They cheated. No jet lag now. And this is my wife Janet. You've all met her. Some of you know her. We've been married 42 years as of last week.
Oh,
I love her more now than when I married her. I think she's prettier now too. And we have 4 kids and 16 grandkids, just so you know.
oh my God.
2 years ago we brought 6 of our oldest grandkids here, and we took them. They all had hats like me. They're all little Steve Rays. And we had a blast with them on the trip. They wanted to lead the rosary everywhere, and they wanted to help with everything, and they're fun. And so Janet and I have been to the Holy Land over 150 times, and we've at least brought 60 groups. Always with this same guy here, Amr. The first time we came, we had a Jewish guide. He was my friend. He helped us make our movies, and so kind of out of loyalty, I had to let him be the guide, and he was a disaster. Because he'd say things on the bus like, "Thank God I'm an atheist." Well, you don't say that to a Catholic group, you know. Well, anyway, I just said to Janet, we'll never use him again. So I'm a business guy. I used to have a business. I sold it to do this. And we went back to Jerusalem, and I set up an office in the Notre Dame. And I told the agents to send me your top Catholic guides. So every half hour, a new guide would come in. Janet and I would interview him, take notes. Thank you. We'll get in touch. After the end of the day, Janet and I both said Amr Shahada was hands down the best of all of them. So we called him back in. We talked to him. We said, here's how we want to do business. He said, here's how I do business. We said, hey, we're a good fit. Let's do it. We've done 60 trips together now. I think Janet thinks it's more like 70, but I think all that flying, you kind of lose some of your brain cells, you know. But if it looks crowded, you're correct, because this year Israel had more tourists than any year in history. Over 4 million people have come here, and it's a small country. Israel would fit inside Lake Michigan 2.5 times. It would fit inside Texas 44 times. And then when you have 4 million people a year coming here and they all want to go see the same sites and using the same one airport, it gets crowded. So we are actually at a good time of year. It's not the high season. We shouldn't have as many as April, May, or October, November. Those are tough months. Twice in the last year we couldn't even get people down to see the nativity, the birthplace of Jesus, because the line was over 4 hours long and it was 90 degrees in the church and plus. So we shouldn't have those problems now. It should be fewer people and it should be cooler, so you picked a good time to come. I want to introduce Father Alfonso Aguilar. He's from Madrid, Spain.
Yeah.
He is a great priest that Janet and I have been friends with for what, probably 15 years. And he's been a chaplain with us on other pilgrimages, but it's his first time to the Holy Land. So I am so excited to show a priest. You've been reading these things in the Mass, you've talked about them, and now you get to see them for the first time. So it's exciting for me. How many are the first time here? Oh, I love it. Everybody, Elmer, almost. Good. We're excited to show you. We're going to pray every mystery of the Rosary where it took place. Except for one. You know which one that is? The coronation, because we can't get up to heaven yet. But we'll pray it at the best place where she fell asleep and was assumed to pray it at that place. So we're going to have a great time. It should be, there may be a little rain here and there, but it's to your advantage because it should be cooler. So a lot of times we bring groups in the middle of the year, it can be over 100 in places, and it's much more comfortable. Also, I'll introduce in a minute Amr. He's a great guide and friend. We've become great friends together. Our families, we come over here for his kids' weddings, and we've got to be good friends as well as colleagues doing this together. He's show you a little bit how confusing this country can be. He is a Palestinian by nationality, because this was, since the 2nd century, called Palestine. And his family's lived here from over 800 years, right? In fact, he says that when you read in the day of Pentecost, people said, how long have you been a Christian? He says, well, since Pentecost. It says that there were Arabs, and our family was among them. So he's also Arab, because that's his mother tongue and language and culture. So Palestinian and Arab. He's also a Roman Catholic by religion and an Israeli citizen with an Israeli passport. So he is... Most of the guides in Israel are Israelis, and most of them are atheists, or they don't believe. That's at least our experience. And I wanted to have a Catholic guide with us, because we can be honest with you along the way. If I had a Muslim driver and a Jewish guide, I couldn't talk to you honestly about a lot of things. But I can talk to you about Islam, I can talk to you about Christianity, I can talk to you about the real situation in this country. Why? Because I have a guide and a driver that agree with us and understand who we are and what we're doing. Our driver is David. He's a great driver. We love this guy. Get to know him. He's a lot of fun, and he's also a very good driver and very helpful. And this is his bus, and he always keeps it very clean. So we have about a 2-hour ride, and we're going to sell some rosaries, right? Okay. Did everybody get the 3 pre-pilgrimage letters that we sent out? Did anybody not get them? Good. Were they helpful?
Yes.
Okay. We try to find all the questions people have and answer them ahead of time for you, and that, like the weather and the clothes and electricity and all of that, so you can be prepared for things. By the way, Janet and I do this not as a way of making income or a way of taking tours or a way of giving you a good time. Our main goal is we want to convert the world. I want people to be authentic Catholics, disciples of Jesus Christ. And I don't think there's a better way to do that than to bring you to the Holy Land and take you to these places, pray Mass and Rosary and talk and learn. Because the reports we get back from people is it changed their lives, the Bible came alive, and they're real disciples of Jesus Christ now even more than when they came. And that's our goal. That's really what our whole purpose is to do. Okay, Father. You ready?
Thank you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we thank you, Lord, especially for this such a safe flight for all of us who come from different places and took a different
Bus 11. You know what bus 11 is? Your two legs. So, trying to wake some of you up, that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, do you think I'm really that naive? You're looking at me as if you're paying attention. You're not paying attention. I'm a teacher by nature. I used to teach before I did this, so I know who's sleeping, who's really focusing, who's really just nodding their heads, you know, just shut up. How about if I give you a little gift? Would that wake you up? You like maps?
Yeah.
I'll give you a map of the Holy Land. I'll give you also something in that little envelope, which is one of the rosaries that later I will offer if you want to buy them in a dozen. But I put a little rosary in each of those packs. And I also included in there a little Christmas ornament for your Christmas tree made of olive wood, the traveling, Magi's. And it has our name on it, Bestor. That's us here in the Holy Land. I know corporate deals with you and on the other side.
Left where it has a rugged looking guy standing there, bare feet, top left on that one side. That is my favorite picture of Joseph. You know, the thing is that back home you see these statues and these pictures of the Holy Family and of the saints, and they all look, Joseph always looks very effeminate. He's always carrying a nice flower. You know, he's so clean and looks like he's on his way to a dinner party somewhere. He says, but I don't think that's what Joseph looked like at all. I think that he was a rugged, tough guy. Carpenter doesn't mean what we think of. It means a day laborer, a grunt, somebody who's out in the sun humping rocks around all day, carrying and chipping rocks. We'll talk about that at Nazareth. But these folks in Nazareth lived in caves. The Holy Family didn't live in a house with refrigerators and air conditioning and blow dryers. They lived in a cave. They were very rustic. Joseph and Jesus worked 12 hours every day, and they were brown from the sun, wrinkled skin. These were tough, masculine, manly men. And this is my favorite picture of Joseph. I think that pictures him what he was really like, a rugged man. And if you see the other pictures down below, those are the city gates of Jerusalem. And when we get there, look back at these and imagine what Jerusalem must have been like even 100 years ago. It must have stunk. It must have been the most miserable place to be, because all the animals were in the city going through the streets. They didn't have any plumbing, and it gets to be 90 degrees often all through the summer. There's no breeze blowing through that city. Just imagine what it was like. Look at how rustic. This is only pictures from 100 years ago. Imagine what it was like even 2,000 years ago. And then if you flip it over, at the bottom right, I think that's somewhat what Mary looked like. Also, you see all these beautiful pictures of Mary, right? She's always just so groomed, and her hair just out of the beauty parlor. Her feet are so clean, and when she went to the pedicure and got the toenail polish on and everything. But really, think about it. Mary had to walk to the well. There was no water in Nazareth. The well was 15 minutes walk away. And these two ladies here, that's what Mary did every morning and every night. She would get up in the morning, first thing, put her jug on her head and walk to the well with little Jesus following behind her. Wait for me, Mommy, wait for me. And she's going down this little dirt path for 15 minutes to the well to fill her jug and bring it back with water. In fact, I think that's how the angel met Mary. She had just come back from getting water at the well, and it had rained that morning, and she was walking down that dirt path in her little bare feet, just like these ladies. Look at these ladies' feet. And Mary was probably walking back from the well, and it sounded like this as she's walking through the mud and then manure back to the cave. And the angel comes and meets this girl with flies buzzing around her head and muddy feet and says, "Hail Mary, full of grace." So you don't think about her that way. You see all these pictures, it's like she's in a palace. and she's wearing gold jewelry and all. But this is not the Mary, the real girl. This gives you an idea of what she might have been like. And when we're in Nazareth today, I'll try to share that a little more with you. But these are all just pictures to help you see what it was like, not what it's like today, but what it was like more in Mary's time. If you see the middle picture there, with all the camels with the luggage on them, that is your escort back to the airport, just so you'll know. We want you to have an authentic Holy Land experience, so we have arranged all these camels and these guys to take you to the airport at the end of the trip. That was this is actually the last group we had here. But these, I hope you enjoy these pictures a little bit to just put you back in a state of mind of what it would have been like. I'll wait till we get to Nazareth to ask the question, because it's more fun if I can look at the young people in the eye and ask the question, but we'll do that. So, we're off to Mount Tabor for Mass at the Mount of Transfiguration. Then we're going to go from there to Cana of Galilee, and there we're going to renew wedding vows and learn a little bit about that site. John chapter 2, remember the 6 stone water jugs for purification. We'll talk about all those things. You'll see the original church that was built there underneath the church that's there today. And after that, we will go to lunch in Nazareth, and we're going to stop at a very nice family restaurant. And then we're going to go to Nazareth, and we'll go to the Church of the Annunciation, where the rosary began, by the way. Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you. Those words are spoken. You will stand right in front of the cave where Mary lived as a young girl, and you will pray that mystery of the rosary right where the angel said those words. And on the altar there, in Latin, it says, the Word became flesh here. The Word became flesh here, at this place, at the entrance of this cave. And that's where you'll pray that mystery of the rosary of the Annunciation. So we have 3 rosary mysteries today that we'll cover. Along the way, we're going to have different lunch experiences. We want you to have a real unique experience every day for lunch. Different kinds of food and different kinds of cultures. And all the lunches are included, by the way. So anyway, we're coming up on a mountain here on the right very soon. You'll see it right here on the right, called the Hills Hattim. And a battle took place there about 800 years ago, and it set the tone for a lot of what's happening in history today. So I'm going to let Amr tell you. Now, he's going to tell you about this battle. It's between Islam and Christianity. And I told him not to be politically correct when he talks to us, okay? That's one of the things I like about Amr. With other groups, you have to be careful what you say. I said my groups want to know the truth. They want to know what really happened. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't be politically correct. Ecumenically sensitive. Tell the truth. So he's going to talk to you about what happened here and how it still has repercussions in our world today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
This is not an easy subject to open with, but whatever the road dictates. So we are passing by a little area here on your right hand side. Pretty soon you're going to see a flat piece of land, and all that sticks up in the middle is that camel hump, which we call the horns of Hattin. Hattin in Hebrew means wheat. This is an area that has been since biblical times always planted with wheat, and this is where they harvested wheat. And this is a rock formation that sticks in the middle that has the shape of 2 horns. If you take an aerial photograph, it has the shape of 2 horns. So the name is a combined name, or a compound name if you want, called the Horns of Hattin. That's where the name comes from. Just a quick preparation. This land has changed hands so many times. I believe you have an idea. Back in 1099, because of the persecution of the Christians, 1099, that's more than 1,000 years or 1,000 years ago, the Christians' persecution invited the 5 countries in Europe, England, Italy, Spain, France, and Germany, to come on what you know as the Crusades. And they came and they took over. And I'm skipping a lot of details, but I want to tell you, unfortunately, in less than 100 years that the Crusaders been here, due to, you know, corruption and being a little bit liberal, they started showing signs of weaknesses when in the east a Muslim force was rising, decided to take the chance and cross to this land again and try to defeat the Crusaders. As they made their way from the east, and I mean really from the area of the Sea of Galilee, they crossed and they took over Tiberias. The headquarters of the Crusaders were north of Nazareth, about 14 miles in the direction that we're driving. The news came that the Muslims are making their way inland. The Crusaders set out to meet them, and this field to your right-hand side was the meeting point right here. This plain on your right-hand side. The Muslims have made it to this place a night before the Crusaders, and they have camped on this hill that you see up straight ahead. We see the trees up there. Up there, there's a permanent source of water, a spring. The Muslim warriors were fully rested. They came here the night before. The Crusaders made it to this battlefield on the same day. Let's say what the day was, the 4th of July, 1187. A day that Americans connect to because that's your Independence Day. Am I correct? Now, for you to remember, this is July. July, we can easily measure 115 degrees here. Now, if you keep in mind, if you've seen movies, medieval century movies of knights and crusaders, I don't know if you can imagine how the Crusader knight looks like on a big horse with a sheet covering the back of the horse as Jerusalem crosses on it. A big knight, and he's armed with a huge shield, a helmet, a spear, and arrows, and all of that. He's really loaded. And he has traveled 14 miles on the back of that horse to come to meet the Muslim warriors over here, who, on the contrary to all this description, are on Arabian light movement horses, not as loaded as the Crusaders, fully rested. The horses are not thirsty, they're not tired. By the time the Crusaders made it to this point, I call them, they were like a fig, just barely hanging on the tree, ready to fall and splash. They're ready to be slaughtered. That's what they were. They came here, and the Muslims came down from this hill that you see now to your right-hand side, on the other side, and they slaughtered the Crusaders. Thousands were slaughtered that day. Those who fled all the way north, and they came to the capital of Lebanon today, which is Beirut, not too far from here. The defeat of the Crusaders was on the 4th of July, 1187. Without going into too much, going around, since Steve wants me to be politically incorrect, I'll tell you this much. This is recorded in history as the first battle between two forces based on religious differences. This is the first battle marked as Christians versus Muslims. And since then, this has been going on non-stop. You folks don't live that, but we do on a daily basis. I was just discussing with Steve and Janet what's going on in the social media right now during the times of the holidays that we're going through. Are the Muslims allowed to say to the Christians, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year? The orders were given to the Muslims not to greet the Christians, because if you greet them, then you agree with them, with their agenda, with their calendar, with all of that. You know what? Who cares? Do I really care if they greet me or they don't? I don't. But that's the sick, negative way of thinking that they're living. And to my best understanding, they're going backwards, not forward. They're not living with the people, they're living with their own. They're closed in. They are so much controlled by their religion, which they call a religion. I call it an ideology, very political ideology that aims to control over the world. That's what they do. And you know how they do that? Not by, powerful way of thinking, but by actually growing and outnumbering people everywhere. That's how they do it, if you really think about it. I know America is close to 300 million people right now, but if that way keeps going the way they're doing it, some of you are in the Michigan area, drive through Dearborn, Michigan, and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. You know that down the road they will be big in number, and they'll be part of the decision making of the administration in the United States. That's the case in London today, in England, that's the case in France, and that's the case in many other places. I don't know if you're aware of that. But all of this goes all the way down to where? To this battle that we just talked about. That's the beginning of the conflict between Christianity and Islam. That's why that term crusaders have been brought up in the last 2 decades so many times. Your ex-president Bush talked about the crusaders and people thought he's nuts. Okay? Well, he may be nuts. I mean, I've had dinner with the man in Texas, in Beaumont, Texas, before he became a president, and I wasn't really impressed, to be honest with you. But his advisors taught him how to speak, and when he brought up the name or that term, crusaders, the Muslim world went up on their toes, because the Muslims are more informed on the history than we are, than the Christians are. That's the sad part. They have a plan and we don't. They rely so much on our teaching, which is what? Forget and forgive. That's what we teach. I think, basically, we should adopt the Jewish policy in that regard. You know what the Jews would say? What? Respect and suspect. That's a better policy. You Americans living in the United States, you were shocked at September 11, weren't you? I was too, but I wasn't surprised. I was shocked at the magnitude of that. Needless to say, I was flying American Airlines same day out of Houston to Newark to come back to Tel Aviv. Of course, that didn't happen. I was stuck there for 10 days. When I saw that on the screens of television back home, back in the United States, I knew what it was. It immediately sent me back to the Horns of Hattin. Those things happen all the time. The Americans knew about them because it hit them right in their backyard. But they're happening in the Middle East every day. That's what people need to know. I mean, Christmas markets in Europe, all the suicide bombing and killing that goes on every day, the Egyptian Coptics that are being harvested like flies every day, the Syrian refugees that we hear about. 2 million Christian refugees are roaming around the Middle East and parts of Europe today. Because of what? Because of the ideology which the Muslims call a religion. This is what's happening really in this part of the world. I just want to say to the Americans this much, because I'm very much American made. I don't know if you already noticed that, but You know, today I have a business in the States, and I went to school in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a graduate. I don't know if anybody from that area. Anybody from there? Good. Good. I'm a UNM. Okay? So, everything that I have, everything that I am today is thanks to the Americans. And I've been coming to the States for the last 30 years. And I have to say that in the last 2 decades, I have seen America in decline. As a visitor, as an outsider, you may not notice that, but we do as an outsider. I have to say that in the last 2 years, I see America starting to go up again. Keep going up. You do not need outsiders to dictate the American way of life. If somebody comes to live in the United States, they live by your rules, not you have to adjust to the foreigners. I look at the faces and I see Filipinos and I see Mexicans and I see British and Irish, and you're all living in harmony because you decided to become an American citizen. Don't let a Muslim come in and dictate to you the way of life in America. If people don't like the way you live, take a day off, help them pack, and show them the way out. God bless America, folks.
I like that Dahmer tells you this because he lives here. In Nazareth, it's roughly 68% Muslim, 32% Christian, something like that. And so they live with this every day, and they know what's going on. And we in America don't. So I asked Amr on that day, because of the Horns team, to share that with us. Now, just so you'll know, this trip is not a political trip. We're here to have a spiritual experience following Jesus and Mary and the apostles and the kings and the prophets, but to not talk a little here and there about what's actually happening in the world and what's happening here. We would be remiss not to do that. So I thank you, Amr, for sharing that with us. Look over here on your right, about 2 o'clock on the right. See that big hill there?
Yeah.
And there's a church up on top?
Mm-hmm.
That's where we're going to have Mass.
Oh.
At 8 o'clock up on that church, up on that mountain. That mountain is 1,900 feet high, above sea level, I should say. 1,900 feet, though. If you start right here at the bottom and go up, you're climbing 1,900 feet. And people always ask me, how long did it take Jesus to go up there? Well, I got tired of not knowing. So one day when I was here, I just drove my car over and I started at the bottom and I climbed to the top. My knees were good back in those days, and I was hustling. I got up to the top in 55 minutes. Straight up. I didn't go up the road we're going up. I went straight from the bottom, right up straight to the top, which is the way Jesus would have done it, I think. And so it took 55 minutes. I think they were in good shape. They weren't running or hurrying, so my guess is it took them an hour and a half to get to the top. You guys are going to do it in about 10 minutes today in a taxi. But there you have Mount Tabor, the Mount of Transfiguration. I'll let Amr tell you more about the mountain.
Does anybody doubt that this is the place of the Transfiguration? I mean, would somebody dare ask me, how do we know?
How do we know?
How do we know?
How do we know?
How do I know?
How do you know?
My dad told me. Now ask, how does my dad know?
Did his dad tell him?
All the dads have been telling their children where the Transfiguration is, and where the crucifixion, and where the nativity, and where the Annunciation, and where everything else that you are here to see took place. If you think we're exploring with you on this trip, you're wrong. We're going to the same places that our ancestors have been going to for the last 2,000 years. And you know, we were happy with doing that until like about 100 and some years ago. Somebody comes from West Virginia and he tells us, you know, you Catholics are going to the wrong place. This is not the place of the Transfiguration. Excuse me, how do you know? Did your dad tell you that? Was your dad here? Are you getting what I'm trying to say? Mm-hmm. I'm trying to say that the oral tradition is very, very powerful here. Anybody from Texas on this bus? You guys have a famous story of the Alamo. I told the Texan group one time, you guys think that the Alamo took place in Texas? It was somewhere in Washington, D.C. Thank God they had no guns on them. And it's only the Alamo story. That's big if you say something about any story. But it's okay to play with the important stories. The stories of our faith, our life, our existence here. Somebody comes and says, you guys don't know where the Transfiguration... It was up there by Mount Hermon. Really? Jesus would have been freezing cold up there. These guys don't know anything. They're protesting. That's what they are. They're Protestants. But we were here. You know, something that Steve said yesterday. People ask me how long you've been Christian. They think like, you know, we were saved in the last 20 years or something like that. Here you have no choice, but you are born who you are. You don't make changes like that in your life. I mean, my son Philippe, he was born Catholic and he will continue to be Catholic, and he has no other choice but being Catholic. We were Christians as early as Pentecost. Read Acts chapter 2. We were kicked out of here, but we came back. So the last time we crossed the borders, as I'm talking about my family, was 800 years ago. We were back in the faith after the persecution of Islam. We have been persecuted here since 638 AD. It's like 1,400 years. And that persecution never stopped. We Christians that live in Israel today, although a minority, we don't want to go anywhere else. If you ask me why, it's because we live under the state of Israel that has rules that protect us, because we cannot survive under chaos. You know when it's chaos? When the West decides that a certain president in the Arab world has to go down, like what they did to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. I don't know if you heard Trump speaking in the last 2 weeks or last 10 days. Why is he going out of Syria? Why is he going out of Iraq? Because you're wasting your time. You're not going to accomplish anything over there. You're just wasting your time and money. When they brought Saddam Hussein down, they did not improve the situation of the people there. They made it worse. When they brought Mubarak down in Egypt, they made it worse. When they brought Gaddafi down, they made it worse. The best, well, I would say, preserved Christian community today in the Middle East is where? Do you know? In Jordan, because the king is still strong. If the king goes down, the Christians will be persecuted tomorrow, if not tonight. In Lebanon, in Syria, it's the same story. That's what's happening. So we live in Israel because we know that by law we're protected. If Israel was to lift its hands off the Christians, the Muslims, who are 16.5%, will chew us alive. I can tell you that. The only thing that prevents them from doing that is that there is a very strong Israeli control over the situation here. In that regard, God bless Israel too. Right? Okay. I meant to say that this is the Mount of Transfiguration. I took my 6-year-old granddaughter not long ago and I brought her up here and I told her, remember, this is where Jesus was transfigured. Do you think she'll forget that? She'll tell that to her grandchildren. I drove my grandfather one time north of Nazareth and he said, stop on the way. Let me show you. Stop. I stopped. See this fig tree, he said? I said, yeah. I said, this is where I first met your grandmother. I looked at him. I was only 18. I said, so what? And he said, what do you mean, so what? That's where you come around. So we drove off, and as we drove, he says to me, it doesn't hurt if you're passing here in the future with your kids to tell them that. Do you think I did?
Yes.
I did. And I told my grandkids. And I always say, if such an insignificant story can be remembered 3 and 4 and 5 generations, how about the most significant stories? We know where things happen, folks. So today you're going to be celebrating Mass on the spot of where Jesus was transfigured before the 3 beloved ones. Every time he took those 3 beloved ones aside, you know something very important is about to happen. You know where he took him again on the side? Peter, James, and John. Where else? Gethsemane, folks. So there's always a connection between transfiguration and the agony at the garden. As a matter of fact, the church that you see up here was built by an architect whose name is Antonio Barluzzi. He built this church and the one at the Garden of Gethsemane at the same time, simultaneously. One brings in a lot of light in the architecture of the church. One is very dark and dim. One is the sorrowful mystery at the Garden of Gethsemane, and one is the luminous mystery, the Transfiguration. But we'll talk more about that later. To get you ready, and this is what I want you to pay attention to. Every time we get on off the bus, what do you want to take with you? Mainly, you take your whispers with you, your headsets, okay? And we're going to test them on the ground in a minute. You also take your rosaries that you want to touch and leave at the foot of the altar where we pray.
Okay.
You want to take your camera or your phone, your smartphone if you're using that as a camera, and to always be provided with water. Always. Okay? Anything else is not important for this trip. I want to say from the very beginning, because we're about to come to the first stop, folks, please do yourselves a favor and do not shop everywhere you stop. You hear me?
Yes.
Because all vendors, everywhere we go, are not even Christians, even though they sell.
Thank you so much.
Nope. Not just that, the pictures. No, yeah.
And he was going to take over Israel. And Israel didn't have any iron chariots. They just had guys running around with bows and arrows and slingshots and swords. And so they're terrified. And they're up here, and the general of the army's name was Baruch. And he was up here saying, I'm terrified, because look, across the original languages, the way they heard it is, they're discussing his exodus. What had happened at Mount Sinai? The exodus. The people were in Egypt. Egypt represented the world. Pharaoh represented the devil. Slavery represented sin. Those are the 3 enemies of the Christian, the world, the devil, and sin. And that was the picture down there where they were under that slavery. And Moses, Jesus is the new Moses, that Moses had killed a Passover lamb, took him through the waters of the Red Sea, which is baptism, water baptism, and I didn't make that up, because Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 4, as Moses and the children of Israel baptized in the cloud and in the sea, so you've been baptized into Christ. They went through the waters of baptism. They came out into the wilderness. They're hungry, and what did they get? The manna in the wilderness, which is a picture of the Eucharist. So Moses led them out of all of that bondage and slavery into the promised land through water and giving them the food of the journey, the Eucharist, and brings them, Joshua then brings them into the promised land. What's happening here? Jesus says, they're discussing his exodus soon to take place because he is the Passover lamb. He's dying. He takes us through the waters of baptism. He gives us the blessed sacrament, which is the food for the journey, and then he takes us into heaven. And why are Moses and Elijah here? Because if the Old Testament, when Jesus referred to it, he didn't call it the Old Testament. He called it the Law and the Prophets. You have read in the Law and the Prophets. What are the Law and the Prophets? Moses represents the Law. Elijah is the father of the prophets. A year ago, Janet and I were up here filming. We did a whole life of Elijah and Elisha in our series. And we talked about how Elijah was the father of the prophets. So Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. These two guys are like handing on the baton. Lord, we brought it all the way through Sinai, all the way up to here. Now you're going to take us down to Jerusalem and you're going to finish the Exodus all the way to heaven, and they're passing the baton on to Jesus, and he takes him and keeps running along. This is the beauty of when you come to places like this. You have to think about Old and New Testament, and we'll do that all along the way as we go. One last comment about this. When I was an evangelical Protestant, I used to make fun of Catholics for praying to dead saints. I would say, where in the Bible does it say you should pray to dead saints? Now the way I answer that when somebody asks me is, where does the Bible say saints are dead? I never realized that Jesus was talking to a dead guy. Moses had died 1,500 years earlier and was buried on the other side of the Jordan River on Mount Nebo. We're taking a group next month in February to Jordan. We'll be up on Mount Nebo where Moses died and looked out over the land. He had died and been buried, and yet he was talking to Jesus, and they recognized who he was. And Moses was aware of what was happening and even discussing what's happening here on earth. And when I became Catholic, all of the Bibles made so much more sense to me. So that was an interesting observation on my part, to realize that Moses was actually discussing with Jesus what was going to happen. You know, it says that they are in heaven having a feast. And he said to the Jews, some of you, you're not even going to be there, but others will be there having a feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Now the last thing that happened here, you remember in the book of Matthew, the last few verses says, behold, I am with you till the end of the age. Therefore go out and baptize, teaching the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and lo, I am with you till the end of the age. That's the end of the book of Matthew. Where do you think Jesus said those words? You read a couple verses earlier, it says, Jesus said after his resurrection, meet me at the mountain in Galilee. And they came to this mountain. They all crawled up here this time, not just Peter, James, and John. Hour and a half scrambling up there, no road at the time. And they're saying, okay, what are we here for? He told us to meet us. Where is he? And all of a sudden he appears. And when you go up on that platform, we'll give you a little time up on that platform, you'll look out over the Jezreel Valley. On a clear day, you feel like you're looking out over the whole world. And Jesus went up there, and I think he was very dramatic. He loved a good backdrop. You'll see that as we go along, too. And I think he said, guys, I've done it. I'm finished. All authority now has been given to me. I'm giving you guys a job. I want you to go into all the world. And I think he's looking there and he just, all of the world, see guys in every direction. I want you to go and proclaim the gospel and baptize not just individuals but nations. Baptize the nations and call them to be disciples of mine. And they did a good job of it. You know how I know? Because you're all back here today 2,000 years later. They went out and preached the gospel. They baptized. They taught. And Jesus has been with his church from the beginning, and he has not left his church. And we're here today, coming back to say thank you to the Lord for all that he did and for what happened up here on the mountain. This is what I love about the Holy Land, is you get a sense of kind of the Old and the New Testament and what happened in these sites. And how many of you knew that Jesus said, go out into all the world from the top of this mountain? You knew that. Good for you. Anyway, take a few minutes. We'll go. We want to be back.
He wants us back at 9:30. That's
We'll make it 9:20. Back to the taxis. And we have
Steve, it's 9:20 now.
9:40. Okay, 9:40. I try to twist time sometimes. It doesn't work. 9:40. That gives you 20 minutes. if there's not masses, check the chapel of Moses and the chapel of Elijah, and look at the apse. You see Moses sitting in the chair of Moses, and you see Elijah with the fire burning, where he caused fire to come down from heaven. So check out those, and then go up on that platform and look out over the Jezreel Valley. And don't use the bathrooms here on the way out. Wait till you get down, because these are nasty bathrooms. And we all have to be there at 9:40 at the taxis, because we all have to go as a group. Otherwise, people get in the middle of us, and it's a big mess. Okay? All right.
Quindi è una pedagogia che Gesù più volte nel Vangelo utilizza per i discepoli, è particolarmente evidente con questa presenza.
This is Cana Chapel here in Cana.
No, we don't have to.
But here we do later after Mass, we go down the road. If there was a crew, Steve can speak you here, and then I'll take you down the road. Switch off your headsets right now. Turn closer if you want to have a seat, please. I just would like to have a seat. Church where they just renewed marriage vows. And if anything, I'd like to say that again, in the 4th century, we had a church here, and if you like to see that in your mind, let me put it this way. We are at the level of the house where the wedding took place at the time. But when we built the very first church, it was built little bit above where we are standing. If you look where the stones built, can you see the stones where the exit sign is? That's actually the beginning of the building of the church, meaning you are actually standing in the crypt of the very first church. Okay? Because if you really look at the level of where the exit sign is, take that above your heads and connect that with the doorstep right there. Can you see it? All right? That's the church from the 4th century. If you were to go beyond that doorstep, you would come out to a courtyard which was paved with mosaics at the time. Those of you who want to go back in the church where we were, look in the floor of the church, and you will see part of that mosaic. There is a glass piece in the floor, and there you see the mosaic of that very first church. And there's like a script in that mosaic that was the only thing that was preserved, interesting, and that script says that's where he comes from. So the courtyard is out there, and where I am standing is actually the location of the altar area. Right above my head would have been the altar itself. We know this because the church was built like a shape of a cross. This would be the long beam of the cross, and this would be the short beam right here. And you see that. I don't know if I was able to build that for you, but that is where the church was. That church, we know, was destroyed in 614. That's a year when a lot of the churches were destroyed in the Holy Land, when Persia, Iran of today, invaded this part of the world. They destroyed the church, and we never rebuilt a church here. Because the second round of building churches in the Holy Land is usually when the Crusaders come, in the 12th century. But the Crusaders were misled to where Cana is. They did not go to Cana in Galilee, they went to a different Cana. And they built a church over there. That's why we never had a church, besides the first one that I was describing for you. Until when? Until 1878. When is that? Close to the fall of the Ottoman Empire again. That's when the Christians felt safe to start building a church again. And that's the church that was renovated in 2000 in preparation for the visit of Pope John Paul II. Now Saint, of course, John Paul. And that is when they uncovered a lot of the things that you were telling you about today. Because they were getting ready for the visit of the Pope, and they discovered a lot of things. Among many things, on the way out, we go out this way, you will see that we uncovered ruins of a monastery from the 4th century. We did only a sample excavation because this is a living town today. You can't destroy buildings in order to do excavations, but we uncovered a sample of that monastery that was very active here at the time. So this is actually the actual location which has been visited for the last 2,000 years. I just want to close by saying a lot of the archaeology, the Christian sites that you're visiting, were done by Franciscan archaeologists. Some of the big names are Bagatti and Corbo and other big names, Pixner and other names. But these are early Christian archaeologists that worked at the end of the previous century into the beginning of the present one, or actually I should say end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th, because a lot of those places are in the hands of the Christians, so we're able to do archaeological digs. I'm going to pass the mic to Steve, and if you come closer and read the passage behind here so the group can go by, then we can have a little bit of privacy. Now, these guys are
Gospel of John. I don't know if you know that or not. It's a 450-page book. And I love the Gospel of St. John. And I love to share about it while we're here. The Gospel of John is like rowing across the Sea of Galilee. You go across, you see the beautiful sight, the sunrise, the fish jumping, the shoreline. If you read the Gospel of John just on the surface, it's like rowing across the Sea of Galilee and enjoying that. But if you put on scuba gear and you jump out of the boat and go down into the sea, there's a whole other world under there. And that's the way it is with the Gospel of John. John writes the Gospel so marvelously that he's telling a wonderful story on the surface of Jesus and all this. But when you dive into it, there's a whole other world under there of deep spiritual truths. And in order to understand the Gospel of John, you have to first understand the book of Genesis. I learned that. In fact, John's Gospel begins with "in the beginning." What other book of the Bible begins that way? And I think he's even telling you from the very first 3 words that if you want to understand my book that begins with "in the beginning," you have to understand the first book that begins with "in the beginning." We'll get to that in just a moment. But John, what he does is he bookends things. He tells you when something is important, he introduces it at the beginning of the book, and then he'll bring it up again in the end. For example, Mary. Some people, and I know when I was a Protestant, we would say that Mary wasn't so important. You Catholics making way to her too important because she's only mentioned twice in the Gospel of John. Well, sometimes it's not how many times it's mentioned, but where it's mentioned. Mary bookends Jesus in the beginning. She bookends his beginning of his earthly ministry here, and the last time she's mentioned is where? At the foot of the cross, which is the last moment of his earthly ministry. And not only that, but he said, "It's not time for my ministry to begin yet." And she said, "Yes, it is." And she's the one that told him when his earthly ministry was to begin, even against his own inclinations. He said, "No, it's not time." She said, "Yes, it is," and walked out. She bookends with Peter. At the very beginning, John chapter 1:42 says, "Oh, nice to meet you, Simon. You will be called Cephas," which means rock. And in the end, "Peter, feed my sheep and tend my lambs." John is telling you how important Peter is by telling you at the beginning he's going to be called the rock, and in the end he's the shepherd and be taking care of the sheep. It goes on and on like that, the whole thing. Now, you come here, we also have, I'll do one more. In the beginning, this is the whole theme of the Gospel of John. I could talk for an hour on this alone. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So he's making a claim that this Jewish guy walking around with curly hair, with camel dung between his toes, with flies buzzing around his head, that's God. That's a pretty tall order to prove. Because the Jews knew that no one could ever see God. He's invisible. How can that curly-haired guy be God? Well, John knows that he has to prove that, and he goes through the whole gospel with the goal of proving that Jesus is God. Even to the point where John never uses the word miracle. He only uses the word sign. What does a sign do? It points you to something. The signs are pointing you to the divinity of Christ. How many signs are there? Only 7. What's the perfect number? The perfect number is 7, the number of God. Even in the number of signs that he gives, he's telling you that he's God, the number 7. Now, he says that he is God. He has to prove that all the way through this book. And at the end, it would be impressive. If he's proved it, then he at the end says, "Okay, see, I proved it." But what if it's much more impressive if he lets the skeptic have the final word? The atheist, the agnostic. Thomas walks into the room. And he says, "I'm not going to believe. I don't want to. I'm a doubter. I'm a skeptic. I'm the atheist kind of guy. I'm not going to believe until you prove it to me." Jesus, "Okay, come here. Put your finger in my hand and your hand in my side." Thomas falls on his knees and says, "My Lord and my God." Look who concludes at the end that John proved that he was God in the end as the skeptic. See, that's how he bookends. Now, let's come here. The water. John mentions water in the beginning and water at the end. So you know if he's talking about water jars, and it's important somewhere, you're going to find it at the end of the gospel. So he said there are 6 stone water jars for the purification of the Jews. That water jars were not full of water for drinking. They were for washing your hands, pots and pans. It was dirty water, in other words. The number 6 in the Bible means incomplete. The number of man, the number of sin, incomplete. Big problem. It's like one can of beer short of a 6-pack. When you have only 6, it's incomplete. It's not full. Make it 7, and it becomes complete. That's the number of God. So he says there's 6 jars. So there's something that's incomplete, and it's only for cleansing outward things, hands and feet, pots and pans. And it's only for the Jews. So it's very limited, it's very weak, incomplete. Now we get to the end of the gospel. Where's water mentioned again? Think of the divine mercy. Water from his side. Very good, Jerry. Water from his side. So now we come to the end of the gospel. Water is mentioned again, and it's coming from the side of Christ. In other words, Jesus becomes the 7th jar. Now the number is complete. The water, all have understood the water to be baptism, which brings us into the life of the church. So from the side comes water that is not for cleansing of just the Jews, but for the whole world. And not just for outward things like pots and pans, but now it cleans inward. So now the number 7, the full number, it cleans inside for the whole world. John wants you to think of these things as you're reading along. Another thing that's very interesting is that water coming from the side of Jesus. There's the fathers of the church, and this is very fun to find these things in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, God created man in a garden. And the man needed a wife. So God put Adam to sleep. He cut open his side, took out part of his body, and from that body created a bride. When Adam woke up, he said, "Oh my goodness, is she beautiful? Woman, she's from the side, from bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she shall be called beautiful woman." And can you imagine what he thought when he woke up? Now, that's what happened in the first garden. Now, did you know that John, when he talks about the crucifixion, he said that it took place in a garden? Why does John tell you that the crucifixion took place in a garden and that the tomb was in a garden? Because he wants you to think of the first garden. So what happens in this new garden? God has the new Adam in a garden, and he doesn't have a bride. So he puts Jesus, the new Adam, to sleep on the cross, cuts open his side with a lance, the blood and water come out, and he takes that part of the body of the second Adam and he fashions it into the church. Water represents baptism, which brings you in. The Eucharist is also the initiatory rite into the church. He creates a bride out of the body of Jesus. He creates the bride. Jesus wakes up from the tomb and looks at you and says, "I love you. You're beautiful. You're my bride." Isn't that fascinating? The parallels between those two. The whole Gospel of John is like that. That's why I had so much fun. I want to go back and rewrite it. It'll be 1,000 pages. Because every time I read it, new insights come. But just to show you here, those 6 stone jars, what they mean in the bigger picture, the deeper picture of John, is that Jesus comes, he fulfills everything. He makes it full. He's the new bride. He gives birth to he's the new groom, and he gives birth to the bride. And it's all tied into Genesis. So just a few little tidbits while we're here to help you think about what happened here. All right, we'll go up.
Church and a Reformed church next door. Everybody's claiming this is the spot. And, in Jerusalem, for instance, when you go in the Holy Sepulchre, the same building is shared by 6 denominations. The time of to come to church. That would be a good example for the younger generation of going church back in 2000, the story, which created a big clash between Muslims and the Christians.
A little bit further.
That's why I'm saying, if you look in one way, you look in a different way, you don't mix them this way. But it's still coming together, so I'm trying to bring a bit more. We got the keys to the city, even though they're the majority. Come closer in the back, please. Come closer. I told the group one time, don't take pictures of the church, that would hurt the stone, and they believed it. And then if you look on both sides, you have this beautiful decoration, which is actually a repetition of the letter M, Mary. This is a Marian shrine, if you never thought about it. Okay? And then you come down one level on the facade and you see the angel Gabriel to the left, Mary, Virgin Mary to the right. That's the scene of the Annunciation. You come down one more level and you can see the four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, with their figures. Matthew the man, and Mark is the lion, Luke is the bull, and John is the eagle. Those are images borrowed from the Old Testament, from Ezekiel. They're actually borrowed into the New Testament, okay? Simply man for Matthew, because Matthew speaks of the humanity of Christ, versus John, who speaks of the divinity of Christ. Mark speaks of his death and resurrection a lot. So he is the lion cub that takes him 3 days to open its eyes when it's first born. And then you come to Luke is the bull, because Luke is a symbol. The bull is the symbol of what? The sacrifice. Luke speaks of Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice for the forgiveness of our sins. So that's where those images were attached to the four evangelists. That's the idea. If you look all the way to the left, you can see from Genesis 3:15, the verse that speaks about the unity between the serpent and the woman. All right? And if you look this way, you're going to see Isaiah 7:14. And the virgin shall be with a child, and he'll be called Emmanuel. One of the prophecies about the Messiah, of course. I like for you to pay attention to the verse, verbum caro factumus et habitat in nobis. And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. This is what I was saying on the bus yesterday. Folks, without this place, there is no Bethlehem. The beginning of life is here, the birth is in Bethlehem. That's very important to keep in mind. And I want you to see in the two openings the universal symbol of the Franciscans. When you see the Jerusalem cross and you see the two hands on a globe, that's the universal symbol of the Franciscans. The two hands of Jesus and Francis showing the stigmata, the bleeding of St. Francis when he received the stigmata. Now, the Jerusalem cross is something you want to learn about, because that's really the typical cross of the Holy Land. You look at the cross and it is one big cross, but then you have four small crosses at the four corners. You see that? Jerusalem is the big cross. And out of Jerusalem came the word of God to the four corners of the world. That's the idea. You got that? Here's one more. Jerusalem, or the big cross, is actually Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But if you want the Catholic interpretation, it is the big cross and four small that makes total of 5. The 5 wounds of Jesus on the cross. So if you're thinking about what do I want to get something authentic, typical of this land, a Jerusalem cross is something that you want to consider. I tell you this because people ask me all the time, what do I get from here? Get when we stop in Bethlehem at the store, if you want a Jerusalem cross, that is typical gift to buy yourself, to buy family member. When you go back home, explain to them what that is, and that would be very authentic, something to take home with you. By Germany back in the 60s when this church was finished. This was finished in 69, by the way. I mean, I remember the church that used to be before that wasn't as big. The reason we built this big church is because in 64 we had the visit of Pope Paul VI, and that was a big event here. You know why it's a big event? Because Pope Paul VI is the first pope to visit the Holy Land since St. Peter. This was a big gift for the Christian, population here, and we thought, we need a big church. From now on, millions are going to start coming, and we need to get prepared. All that went down the tubes because of all the wars between 67, 73, 81, 2000, 87, I forgot one, and then 2000, and then You know what crippled us most of all? September 11th, 2001. We were 4 years, not even one tourist was on the lake. 4 years. But anyway, 2006 was another war in South Lebanon. In between we have a lot of commercials, what I would call. And, they promoted Israel as not a safe place to go to. You don't want to go to. So we doubled this year. We're telling people don't come because we don't have space. Adam and Eve, the story of Adam and Eve in paradise and eating apples. I don't know if it was apple at all, we don't know that. They were expelled out of paradise. Men had to work very hard to make a living. Women with a lot of pain would bring children to the world. We continue to sin and we come to the story of Noah and the flood. And then God renews his treaty with mankind with the story of Abraham, who was asked to sacrifice his only son, whose name is Isaac. Oh, must be Christian. For those who do not know, the same story is in the Quran, and the name is Ishmael, not Isaac. And that's where I always say, had Abraham stayed with one wife, he could have saved us a lot of this one here. This is more friendly to me. It speaks of the nativity. It speaks of the flight to Egypt. Joseph and Jesus are making the recliners on the remote controls. Who told you that he was a carpenter? I don't know where you got that idea. We don't even have trees. What do we have so far that you've seen in abundance? Stones and stones.
Yeah.
Trees. I mean, we don't have that. Somebody made a mistake there. Anyway, here we have the story of the baptism. And this is where you are going to visit, not celebrate Mass. We usually have Mass on the Mount of Beatitudes, but because tomorrow they're closed, they're going to have it somewhere else. So we will visit the Beatitudes. This is the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the crucifixion. And up there you have the resurrection and the ascension of our Lord. Got it? Anything new? I'm not really adding anything new, right?
Right.
Come see where Mary was minding her own business, and the angel decided to address her. Something called theophany in the world of theology. So that's when an angel addresses somebody directly. That's a direct message from God. Just go in quietly.
Excuse me. Excuse me. Let's see.
This is the main church on top of the cave.
All I can tell you is that this church is completely dedicated to the Holy Family. I mean, all the work that you see on the wall from nations of different countries around the world are all of the Holy Family, Mary and the Child. Some years Our Lady of Guadalupe is right there. The donation of the United States is that silver one right there, number 3 from the back over there. My favorite one is if you go closer to that window, the light comes on, and that is Our Lady of China. Beautiful work. Of course, we have many other countries. We have Canada and Japan, Portugal, and Spain, and everywhere. We got one from every corner of the world, actually. Some are outside the church, and some are inside the church. The one picture, a mosaic picture that you want to look at.
Dedication to Paul VI.
From the Holy Family, so I'm going to give the mic to Steve.
Yeah,
What do you do with the old ones?
I use them for around the house when I'm out working in the yard. I give them to the grandkids. The other hat was getting too faded and getting too floppy, so I needed a new one. What I want to do, you might want to just make a walkway there because people are going to come and go. Just make a walkway so they don't get through that side. But what I want to talk about here is the Holy Family and what it was like for them during a typical day. What it was like to wake up in the morning, do what they do all day, and then fall asleep at night. So let's start with this. There were 25 caves in this area. Everybody lived in a cave. No running water, no electricity, no air conditioning, no heaters except for the fire that they had. They lived very simple and rustic life. They get up in the morning. They're laying on mats and they get in the cave. They're going to go down and see a little bit of the cave. Under those churches, there's the church level, then there's another grotto level which we're going to go to. Underneath that is the cave. They won't let us go into the cave because it's the steps of dangerous going down. The ones at the Holy Family where they used to go down into the cave, and because of the temperature changes, they don't let anybody down. Except I did get down when I did my movie on Jesus to show where he had lived. And the way I did it was, a guy here would say, you can't go down there. And I said, I really need to because Jesus lived 30 years down here. His ministry was only 3 years, 10 times more. He lived right down there. I got to get down there with my camera. Nope, can't do it, can't do it. So I pulled 2 $100 bills out of my pocket.
Ooh.
And I just was holding him, and he says, but I think we can arrange something. And then 10, 15 minutes later, he was happy and I was happy, and you can see the cave if you watch my movie on Mary and Jesus. We actually got down there. But what it is, it's a big cave down there. And there's a place in the middle where they had a fire, and it would have had like smoke going out of a hole. And they would have had mats laying on the ground. And in the walls are niches where they put little lanterns. They were made out of pottery with foil and a little wick, and they'd light the wick in the morning. What Mary would do is get up in the morning and get the fire going, and she would light those candles, those lanterns around the room, and give it a nice mellow glow of the fire, so it'd be light. Now the family would be sleeping on those mats, and the first thing in the morning they wake up. What do you think the Holy Family did?
Go to the bathroom. Go to the bathroom.
What was that I heard over here?
Go to the bathroom.
Ah, you're the first, one of the first ones that has ever answered that way. I always get the answer, they pray. The Holy Family, they get up in the morning, first thing they did was pray. She got it right. Is that the first thing you do in the morning when you get up? You go to the bathroom. Right? And people think the Holy Family didn't do this. They somehow walked 3 feet above the ground and didn't need to use toilets, and they didn't have bodily functions because they were the Holy Family. Jesus pooped his diapers by then. So, now you live in a cave, and there's no running water, there's no toilets, there's no plumbing. What do you do when you have to get up and go to the bathroom?
Go outside.
You have to go outside, and you find a bush, and you go to the bathroom in the bush. Now, how many of you ever thought about Mary doing that in the morning, first thing when she gets up in the morning? We don't think of her. This is why one of the reasons I like to bring people here, to get you to see the real Mary and what was really like, what this guy was really like. They were not angelic people floating out there. They were real rustic people. And they had to get up in the morning, go out of the cave, and find a place to use the facilities. This was the real Mary, the real Joseph, and the real Jesus. Well, after they come back from using the bushes, or whatever else they had, maybe a latrine set up or an outhouse somewhere that the village had, you say good morning, you know where everybody else was going to that morning. And they came back, and Mary would start getting the breakfast ready. They would pray together after that. Then they would pray. You know, Father, you have a ritual where you have certain prayers in the morning, certain prayers during the day, and certain prayers at night. We, the Catholic Church, didn't invent those prayers of the office of readings and the prayers. That was something the Jews did. They had regular readings. All the Jews read the same passages, prayed the same prayers in the morning, just like the Catholic Church does. We got it from them. So they would pray together, they would sing the psalms, they would chant the psalms, and they had them memorized. And then they would have their breakfast, something simple, maybe like smoked or a dried fish, some barley bread. This was a poor family. Remember, Jesus and Mary and Joseph were not a rich family. He was what we call a carpenter, which I'll explain in a minute, but it was the lower rung on the ladder of the economic scale. They were a poor family. How do I know they were poor? Because when they went to Jerusalem, they had to present Jesus at the temple. And at the presentation and Mary's purification after giving birth, they were required to bring a lamb. But a lamb is expensive. So the Old Testament gave you a way up. If you couldn't afford a lamb, then bring 2 pigeons. And then give those as a sacrifice. Joseph brought 2 pigeons because he didn't have the money to buy a lamb. So they were not a wealthy family, so they would have a simple meal. Maybe things like grains, like barley they would have, barley bread. Why? Because the wheat was expensive. That was for the rich people. Barley was for animals and the poor people. So they would have barley. They would grind it up and she'd make barley bread. They didn't have an egg. Maybe they'd have an egg. We know that they had chickens because it says that Jesus didn't say how often would I have a mother hen gathered you under my wings. So they knew about chickens and eggs. But they had very little meat because meat was expensive. So they would eat fruits and grains and nuts and fish. Fish would come from the Sea of Galilee. And then after they ate their breakfast, what did Mary do? She'd send her 2 guys off to work. Now they were carpenters. You think of yourself as a carpenter, someone who's making fine cabinets and furniture in a carpenter shop somewhere. But like Amr said, they didn't have wood here. That wasn't the main thing. They had rock. The word carpenter in Greek is tekton. One, and it means one who works with their hands with hard materials, wood, stone, or metal. It doesn't mean a special carpenter working, making craftsman type things. He was somebody, it was like a field laborer, a grunt, a redneck, a day laborer, somebody that had calloused hands, brown face from being in the sun, wrinkled skin. This is what the carpenter was. Somebody who worked hard with their hands, 12 hours a day. Redneck. How do you get to be a redneck? You bend over working in the sun all day, the sun hits the back of your neck, and at the end of the day, it's red. This is what Jesus and Joseph did. They got up in the morning. Where did they work? Well, there's only 25 caves. Where do you go to find work? You go next door to Josiah. Josiah, over here, you got any work? No, Jesus, you fixed everything yesterday. You know, if you're in business and anybody in sales knows you need a customer base, 25 caves isn't going to do it. What most people think, and I agree, is that over the top of this hill, about a 1-hour walk, was a city called Cyprus, which was being built. It was a Roman city, and they were hiring skilled and unskilled craftsmen from the whole area to build that city at the time Jesus was born. So I think the Holy Family left here in the morning, maybe with the other men of Nazareth, and they walked over the hill. And I know how far it is because I've run back and forth to that place a couple times just to kind of get a feel for where Jesus walked. And I like to meditate when I'm doing that. It took me a half an hour to get there and a half an hour back, so I figured an hour walking. So I'm thinking to myself, what did Jesus and Joseph talk about along the way? Did Joseph teach Jesus, or did Jesus teach Joseph? Remember, he was arguing with the doctors of the law at 12 years old, the professors of Jerusalem. I think Joseph and Mary had to teach him how to pray, how to read the scriptures, how to read the New Testament. Say Jesus didn't know those instinctively. He was a baby boy learning those things in his humanity. So what did they talk about along the way? I like to, when I was running, just think about that. Did they go with the other men in the city and talk to them too, or did they just stay to themselves? Did they pray the songs? What did they do? I think they had a good time. I think he was smiling and laughing, having a jovial time with his boys walking around. They get to work, and what did they build in Sepphoris, the city started up? What was built there? What did they build? It's all made out of stone. Everything, the theaters, the streets, the buildings, the walls, everything is out of stone. So here's what I think Jesus and Joseph did when they got there after an hour walking when the sun was rising. They finally arrived. They go to the union boss. He gives them a hammer and a chisel and he points to a pile of rocks and he says, go to work. Look at this building here. Look at the stones. They're all typical shape, right? God doesn't make stones that way. Or they were collected from the rain. I think with caves, they used what was natural, but they enhanced it. I'll turn this on. Am I on? Yes. Okay, I think the caves were dug because it was soft to dig. And it's when you go to Bethlehem, you'll see some of